The morning sun cast long shadows across Montgomery's empty streets as Sarah Mitchell drove her 1952 Cadillac through the quiet neighborhoods of Alabama. It was 7:45 a.m. on a peaceful Sunday in 1955, and she was headed to the New Hope Baptist Church, where she was scheduled to perform at the morning service. The autumn air was crisp, and the streets were nearly empty except for a few early churchgoers making their way to various congregations. Sarah had just finished adjusting her hat in the rearview mirror when she noticed the road ahead had changed. The familiar route she had driven hundreds of times over the past decade looked different somehow. The city had been making improvements to the streets lately, but she hadn't expected them to reach her neighborhood so soon. As she approached the intersection of Pine and Madison Streets, Sarah slowed down slightly, just as she had done countless times before. This had always been a right-of-way intersection, and she knew every bump and crack in the pavement like the keys on her piano. But today, something was different. Just as her Cadillac crossed through the intersection, the harsh sound of a police siren pierced the morning quiet. Sarah's heart jumped in her chest as she glanced in her rearview mirror to see the flashing lights of a police car. With practiced calm, she guided her vehicle to the side of the road, her white-gloved hands gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter than usual. The clock on her dashboard now read 7:52 a.m. She was already cutting it close for the church service. Officer James Parker approached her car with the slow, deliberate steps that all small-town police officers seem to perfect. His boots crunched against the gravel, and Sarah could see his stern expression in her side mirror. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her years ago. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over today?" Officer Parker's voice was flat and professional as he stood slightly behind her driver's side window, his hand resting casually on his belt. "No, sir, I'm afraid I don't," Sarah replied politely, her voice carrying the natural melody that had made her famous, though the officer showed no sign of recognition. "You ran right through that stop sign back there," he said, pointing back toward the intersection. "Brand new sign, put up just yesterday, but that's no excuse for missing it." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. A stop sign? She turned slightly in her seat to look back at the intersection, and there it was, a gleaming new stop sign she had driven past countless times when there had been none. "I'm so sorry, officer," she said earnestly. "I drive this route every Sunday to church, and I had no idea they put up a new sign. I'm actually on my way to perform at the New Hope Baptist service this morning." Officer Parker's expression didn't change as he pulled out his ticket book. "Running a stop sign is running a stop sign, ma'am. New or not, it's there for public safety." He began writing, the scratch of his pen seeming unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. Sarah sat patiently, watching the minutes tick by on her dashboard clock. She thought about the church choir waiting for her, about the special hymn she had prepared for today's service. But she knew better than to argue or show any sign of frustration. "Sign here," Officer Parker said, holding out the ticket book. Sarah took it with graceful movements, signing her name in the elegant handwriting she used for autographs, not that the officer would know or care about that. "Your fine is $25, payable at the courthouse within 2 weeks," he explained mechanically, tearing off her copy of the citation. "There's information about contesting the ticket if you choose to do so." He handed her the yellow paper without making eye contact. "Thank you, officer," Sarah responded quietly, tucking the ticket into her purse. "Have a blessed Sunday." Officer Parker merely nodded before turning away, his boots crunching back toward his patrol car. As he drove away, Sarah allowed herself a small sigh, looking at the clock again. 8:05 a.m. She would be late for the first time in 15 years of performing at New Hope Baptist. Starting her car again, Sarah straightened her hat once more and pulled carefully away from the curb. This time, she made sure to stop at every intersection, new sign or not. As she drove, she began humming her planned hymn for the day, Amazing Grace. Somehow, it felt even more meaningful now. 2 weeks had passed since the traffic stop, and Sarah Mitchell found herself climbing the worn marble steps of the Montgomery County Courthouse. The building stood tall and imposing against the clear blue sky, its columns casting long shadows across the entrance. It was Tuesday morning, just past 9 a.m., and already the air was thick with Alabama's famous humidity. Sarah had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a navy blue dress with small pearl buttons, matched with sensible heels and white gloves. Her hat, tilted at a perfect angle, featured a small net veil that partially covered her eyes. She looked every bit the respectable woman she was, though she knew from experience that appearances didn't always matter in places like this. The heavy wooden doors creaked as she pulled them open, stepping into the cooler air of the courthouse. The lobby bustled with activity. Lawyers in pressed suits hurried past with briefcases, clerks shuffled papers, and other citizens waited nervously on hard wooden benches. The sound of typing machines and muffled conversations echoed off the high ceilings. Following the signs, Sarah made her way to Courtroom C, where traffic violations were heard every Tuesday morning. She pushed open the courtroom door precisely at 9:15 a.m., the time printed on her citation. The room was already half full, mostly with other traffic offenders who looked as uncomfortable as she felt. Sarah found a seat in the middle row, careful to smooth her dress as she sat down. The wooden bench was hard and uncomfortable, clearly designed to remind visitors they weren't here for pleasure. Around her, people whispered and shuffled papers, while a court clerk organized documents at a desk near the judge's bench. At exactly 9:30 a.m., a side door opened, and Judge William Harrison entered the courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. Everyone stood as the judge took his seat, his black robe settling around him like a dark cloud. Judge Harrison was a man in his early 60s, with thick gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. He had been presiding over this court for nearly 20 years, and his reputation for being strict but fair was well known throughout Montgomery County. Today, however, he looked tired and slightly irritated, as if his morning coffee hadn't quite done its job. "Be seated," he commanded, and the rustle of clothing filled the room as everyone sat down. The judge began sorting through the papers on his bench, occasionally glancing at the crowd over his glasses. Sarah watched as case after case was called. Most were simple traffic violations like her own: speeding tickets, illegal turns, broken taillights. Judge Harrison handled each one quickly and efficiently, rarely spending more than 5 minutes on any case. His sentences were predictable: fines for first-time offenders, higher fines for repeat visitors. As she waited, Sarah noticed the pattern in the judge's behavior. He was shorter with some defendants than others, particularly those who tried to argue their cases or make excuses. His voice would take on a sharp edge when he felt someone was wasting his time, and more than once, he interrupted long-winded explanations with a sharp rap of his gavel. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 10 a.m., and Sarah found herself counting the cases ahead of her. Based on the docket posted outside, she estimated she would be called just before the morning recess. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, were steady, but inside she felt a familiar flutter of nerves, the same kind she used to get before performing at new venues. Around her, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm: names called, people approaching the bench, papers shuffled, fines assigned, next case called. It was like a well-rehearsed performance, each person playing their part in this daily drama of justice. Sarah pulled her citation from her purse one more time, double-checking the details. $25 was a significant amount of money, but it wasn't the fine that bothered her. It was the principle of the matter: the new stop sign, the officer's dismissive attitude, and now this waiting game in a courthouse where she felt distinctly out of place despite her careful appearance. The morning dragged on in Courtroom C as Sarah Mitchell watched defendant after defendant approach Judge Harrison's bench. Her palms had grown slightly damp inside her white gloves, though her face remained composed. The wall clock had just struck 10:45 a.m. when the court clerk's voice finally rang out clear and sharp. "Case number 247, Sarah Mitchell, traffic violation." Sarah rose from her seat with the grace of someone used to performing on stage, though few in the courtroom would have known that. Her heels clicked softly against the wooden floor as she made her way to the defendant's position. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the subtle sparkle of her pearl earrings, a gift from her last concert tour, though that detail too would remain unknown to this audience. Judge William Harrison didn't look up from his papers as Sarah approached. He was already tired from a morning of excuses and pleas, and his patience had worn thin. His wire-rimmed glasses had slipped further down his nose, and he pushed them back up with an irritated gesture as he shuffled through the documents before him. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and boredom, "you are charged with failing to stop at a stop sign on Sunday, September 15th, at approximately 7:52 a.m. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice clear and melodious even in these two simple words. Something in her tone made Judge Harrison pause for just a moment, but he quickly resumed his stern demeanor. "Not guilty?" he repeated, finally looking up from his papers. His eyes narrowed slightly as he surveyed the woman standing before him. "Officer Parker's report clearly states that you drove through a stop sign at the intersection of Pine and Madison Streets. Are you suggesting the officer was mistaken?" Sarah stood straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "No, Your Honor. I'm not suggesting Officer Parker was mistaken about what he saw. However, I believe there are important circumstances that should be considered." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more severe. "Ms. Mitchell, in my experience, there are very few circumstances that justify running a stop sign. But please enlighten the court." His tone suggested he had heard every possible excuse and found them all wanting. "Your Honor, I have driven that same route to New Hope Baptist Church every Sunday for the past 15 years. Sarah began, her voice steady and respectful. The stop sign in question was installed just the day before. There had never been a stop sign at that intersection before. "Ignorance of traffic signs is not a defense, Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison interrupted, his fingers drumming impatiently on his desk. "New signs are installed for public safety. It's every driver's responsibility to be aware of and obey them." Sarah remained composed despite the judge's dismissive tone. "I understand that, Your Honor. I'd always strive to be a law-abiding citizen. Had I noticed the new sign, I certainly would have stopped." "Yet you didn't." Judge Harrison cut in again, picking up his gavel. "Ms. Mitchell, this court sees dozens of traffic violations every week. Everyone has an explanation. Everyone has a reason. The law, however, is clear and must be applied equally to all." The courtroom had grown quieter than usual. Something about Sarah's dignity in the face of the judge's growing irritation had caught the attention of the other waiting defendants. Even the court clerk had paused in her paperwork to watch the exchange. "Your Honor," Sarah began again, but Judge Harrison held up his hand to silence her. "I've heard enough, Ms. Mitchell. This is a simple matter. You failed to stop at a clearly posted stop sign. Whether it was new or old is irrelevant. The fine is $25, payable to the clerk before you leave today. Next case." But just as he raised his gavel to make the judgment official, the bailiff, who had been standing quietly by the judge's bench, took 2 quick steps forward. He leaned in close to Judge Harrison's ear, his hand cupped to ensure his whispered words wouldn't carry across the quiet courtroom. The bailiff's interruption had created a brief pause in the proceedings, but Judge Harrison waved him away with an impatient gesture. The morning was running long, and he had dozens more cases to hear. He turned his attention back to Sarah Mitchell, who still stood before him with unwavering composure. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, shuffling his papers once more, "before we conclude this matter, do you have anything else to add in your defense?" His tone suggested he was merely following procedure rather than showing genuine interest in her response. Sarah took a deep breath, standing a little straighter. The pearl buttons on her navy dress caught the late morning light as she adjusted her position. "Yes, Your Honor, if you would permit me to explain more fully." The judge sighed but nodded, removing his glasses and cleaning them with a white handkerchief. "Proceed, but please be brief." "Your Honor, I've been a member of this community for over 2 decades, Sarah began, her voice carrying the same rich tone that had filled concert halls across the country. "Every Sunday morning for the past 15 years, I drive to New Hope Baptist Church to perform for the congregation. It's not just a duty, it's my way of giving back to the community that raised me." Judge Harrison's expression remained stern, but something in Sarah's voice made him pause in his glasses cleaning. She continued, her words measured and clear. "That Sunday morning, I was running slightly late for the first time in all those years. The church choir was waiting for me, and we had a special performance planned for the morning service. When I approached that intersection, I did what I had done countless times before. I slowed down and looked both ways. A few murmurs rose from the gathered crowd in the courtroom, but the judge silenced them with a sharp look. Sarah's hands, still covered in white gloves, were clasped gently in front of her as she spoke. "I understand now that I missed the new stop sign. It was an oversight that I deeply regret. But I want to assure this court that my record shows I'm not a careless driver. In fact, this is my first traffic violation in over 20 years of driving." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his previous irritation mixing with a growing curiosity. Ms. Mitchell, while your community service is commendable and your driving record may be spotless, the law doesn't make exceptions based on character references. I'm not asking for an exception, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her dignity undiminished by his dismissive tone. I'm asking for understanding. The city's decision to install new traffic signs is important for public safety, but shouldn't there be some consideration for the timing of notifications to regular drivers in the area? The judge's fingers drummed against his desk again, but this time the rhythm was slower, more thoughtful. Are you suggesting the city should have posted notices about the new stop sign? Yes, Your Honor. Many of us who travel these roads daily rely on our knowledge of the usual traffic patterns. A simple notice in the local paper or temporary warning signs could have prevented this situation entirely. A few heads nodded in the gallery, and even the court clerk looked up with interest. Sarah's argument was resonating with others who had probably encountered similar situations with the city's ongoing road improvements. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice growing slightly more confident, I believe the spirit of the law is to ensure public safety, not to punish law-abiding citizens for honest mistakes. I stopped immediately when Officer Parker signaled me. I was cooperative, and I'm here today not to make excuses, but to explain the circumstances truthfully. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, studying Sarah with a different kind of attention now. There was something about her presence, her articulate defense, and her dignified bearing that didn't quite fit with the usual parade of traffic offenders in his courtroom. Just then, the bailiff stepped forward again, more insistent this time. Your Honor, he said, his voice urgent enough to make the judge turn. There's something about Ms. Mitchell that you really need to know. Judge Harrison frowned at the bailiff's second interruption, but something in the man's expression made him pause. He leaned closer as the bailiff bent down to whisper in his ear, one hand cupped around his mouth to keep the conversation private. The judge's eyes widened slightly, then widened further as the bailiff continued speaking. His stern expression gradually transformed into one of surprise and slight embarrassment. The courtroom had grown quiet, watching this unusual exchange. Sarah Mitchell remained standing patiently, her hands still clasped in front of her, waiting with the same grace she showed while standing before much larger audiences, though this was something the judge was only now learning. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, looking at Sarah with new eyes. Ms. Mitchell, he began, his tone noticeably different from before, the bailiff informs me that you, that is to say, you're Sarah Mitchell, the gospel singer? A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several heads turned to look at her more closely now. An elderly woman in the back row gasped quietly and covered her mouth with her hand. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied simply, offering a gentle smile, though I prefer to think of myself as just another member of our community. The judge shuffled the papers on his desk, clearly flustered. Well, that is to say, he paused, collecting himself. My wife and I, we attended your performance at the State Theater last spring. We have all your records. Sarah's smile widened slightly, but she maintained her dignified composure. That's very kind of you to say, Your Honor. I remember that performance well. It was a special evening. More whispers spread through the courtroom as people began to recognize her. A young clerk in the corner was frantically flipping through a magazine in her purse, then holding it up to compare the photograph inside with the woman standing before the bench. Judge Harrison cleared his throat again, his earlier irritation completely gone. Ms. Mitchell, your latest album, Grace Notes. It sits right next to our record player at home. My wife Margaret, she plays it every Sunday morning while preparing for church. I'm honored, Sarah replied quietly. Music has always been my way of bringing joy and inspiration to others. That's why I was so concerned about being late to church that Sunday morning. The chore was waiting for me, and we had prepared a special arrangement of Amazing Grace for the service. The judge was now looking at the traffic citation as if it were a completely foreign object. His fingers, which had been drumming impatiently earlier, were now still. The bailiff stood nearby, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I must say, Judge Harrison continued, his voice softer now, your interpretation of Precious Lord on that album. My wife plays it at least twice every Sunday, says it brings her closer to heaven. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement. The elderly woman in the back was now dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sarah remained modest despite the growing recognition. Music is a gift that should be shared, she said. That's why I've never missed a Sunday performance at New Hope Baptist in 15 years, until that morning with the new stop sign. Judge Harrison glanced at the bailiff, who gave him a slight nod, then back at Sarah. The morning sunlight streaming through the high courthouse windows seemed to cast a gentle glow around her, highlighting the simple elegance of her appearance that he had somehow missed earlier. "Well, Miss Mitchell," he said, straightening in his chair, trying to regain some of his judicial composure. "It seems we have quite a unique situation here." He cleared his throat one more time, his hand hovering over the gavel that just minutes ago he had been ready to bring down with a harsh sentence. The atmosphere in courtroom C had transformed completely. What had started as another routine traffic hearing had turned into something entirely different. The news of Sarah Mitchell's identity spread through the room in excited whispers, like a gentle breeze rustling through leaves. "If I may, Your Honor," the bailiff spoke up, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Mitchell performed at my daughter's wedding last year. She refused to take any payment, said it was her gift to the couple." He smiled warmly at Sarah, who returned the gesture with a graceful nod. A woman in the third row suddenly stood up, clutching her purse tightly. "Oh, my stars, I knew I recognized that voice. Miss Mitchell, you sang at my mother's funeral 2 years ago. The old rugged cross, I've never heard it sung so beautifully." Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. Judge Harrison watched as more people began to share their stories. His courtroom, usually a place of stern justice and rigid procedures, had become a gathering of community members sharing their connections to the woman before him. "She performs at the Children's Hospital every Christmas," someone called from the back. "My grandmother has every record she's ever made," another voice added. The court clerk, who had been quietly working until now, looked up from her papers. "Miss Mitchell, you sang at my church's revival last summer. The congregation still talks about it." Sarah stood quietly through all of this, her humility evident in her gentle smile and slightly bowed head. She wasn't just a famous singer to these people. She was a part of their lives, their community, their most precious moments. Judge Harrison found himself remembering the evening he and his wife had attended Sarah's concert. Margaret had been moved to tears by her rendition of "How Great Thou Art." The program from that concert still sat in their family Bible at home. "Miss Mitchell," the judge said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent earlier, "I had no idea. That is to say, your reputation extends far beyond your musical accomplishments." He paused, looking down at the traffic citation that now seemed so insignificant. "Carnegie Hall, wasn't it, last month?" Sarah nodded modestly. "Yes, Your Honor. Though I must say, singing at New Hope Baptist brings me just as much joy as any concert hall." A young man near the front row raised his hand tentatively. "Judge Harrison, sir, I was at that Carnegie Hall performance. My uncle took me to New York especially to see it. The New York Times called it a triumph of the human spirit." The judge nodded, increasingly aware of the remarkable person standing before his bench. This was someone who had performed on the world's greatest stages, yet still dedicated every Sunday morning to her local church. Someone who had recorded with the biggest names in gospel music, yet sang at local weddings and funerals without asking for payment. "And to think," the bailiff added, "she's never missed a Sunday at New Hope Baptist in 15 years, until that new stop sign went up without warning." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Here was a woman who had brought music and comfort to countless lives, who had represented their community on the national stage, who had remained humble despite her fame, standing in traffic court over a stop sign that hadn't existed the day before. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and polished them again, more out of habit than necessity. When he looked at Sarah now, he saw more than just another defendant. He saw a pillar of the community, an artist who had touched countless lives, and most importantly, a person whose character spoke far louder than any traffic violation. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, acutely aware that every eye in the courtroom was now fixed on him. The morning had taken an unexpected turn, and he found himself struggling to maintain his usual judicial demeanor. The traffic citation on his desk, which had seemed so straightforward just minutes ago, now felt like a weight on his conscience. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty that none of the morning's previous defendants had heard. "I feel I owe you an apology for my earlier abruptness." The words came slowly, carefully chosen. Judges rarely apologized in their own courtrooms, but this situation demanded something different. Sarah's response was characteristically gracious. "No apology needed, Your Honor. You were simply doing your duty, as we all must." The judge shook his head slightly. "No, I'm afraid I was doing more than my duty. I was being—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Prejudiced. Not just about who you are as a performer, but about who you are as a person. I made assumptions based on appearances, and that's not what justice should be about." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. The court clerk had stopped typing entirely, her hands hovering motionless above her typewriter keys as she watched the scene unfold. "Your Honor," Sarah said softly, "we all make judgments. What matters is our willingness to look beyond them." Her words carried the same wisdom that had touched so many hearts through her music. Judge Harrison stood up slowly, something he rarely did during traffic court. "Ms. Mitchell, would you share with the court why you never charge for singing at local events? The bailiff mentioned you refused payment for his daughter's wedding." Sarah's face lit up with a warm smile. "Music isn't just about performance, Your Honor. It's about connection, about bringing people together. When I sing at Carnegie Hall, yes, that's my profession. But when I sing here, in our community, that's my calling. You can't put a price on that." The elderly woman in the back row was openly crying now, and several others were nodding in agreement. Even the other defendants, who had been frustrated by the long wait, seemed moved by the exchange. "And the Children's Hospital?" The judge pressed gently. "You visit there regularly, I understand." "Every Christmas, and whenever they call," Sarah replied. "Music has a way of easing pain, of bringing hope. Those children teach me more about courage than I could ever teach them about singing." Judge Harrison picked up his gavel, then set it down again without using it. Instead, he leaned forward, speaking with genuine curiosity. "My wife, Margaret, she plays your records every Sunday morning. She says your voice helps her find peace. How do you do that?" Sarah's answer came with the same natural grace that characterized everything about her. "Peace isn't something I create, Your Honor. It's something we all carry within us. Sometimes we just need a reminder to listen for it." The judge nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about a missed stop sign anymore. It was about seeing beyond the surface, about recognizing the humanity in each person who stood before his bench. "You've been performing at New Hope Baptist for 15 years, he mused aloud. "Never missed a Sunday until this incident, and all those weddings, funerals, hospital visits. You've been serving this community in ways that go far beyond any legal obligation." "We all serve in our own ways, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "You serve through justice, I serve through music. The goal is the same, to make our community better." The judge looked around his courtroom, seeing it with new eyes. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows now, illuminating faces that had sat in judgment and now sat in reflection. His gaze returned to Sarah, standing dignified and graceful before him, a woman whose impact on their community ran far deeper than he had initially realized. Judge Harrison took a deep breath and straightened his robes. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for his final decision. The morning had transformed from a routine traffic court session into something far more meaningful, and he knew his next words needed to reflect that transformation. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying both authority and humility, "this court finds itself in an unusual position today. While the law regarding stop signs is clear, the circumstances of this case have revealed something far more important than a simple traffic violation." He paused, removing his glasses and looking directly at Sarah. "Your commitment to our community, your dedication to serving others through your gift of music, and your graceful handling of this situation have given this court much to consider." The judge picked up the citation from his desk, holding it up for all to see. "This piece of paper represents one moment in time, a new stop sign, an honest oversight, a rushed Sunday morning. But your character, Ms. Mitchell, represents decades of service, countless acts of kindness, and an unwavering dedication to making our community better." Sarah stood quietly, her hands still clasped in front of her, as the judge continued. "The purpose of traffic laws is to protect our community and maintain order. You, Ms. Mitchell, have demonstrated through years of action that you care more about this community's well-being than perhaps anyone else in this courtroom, myself included." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. The bailiff smiled warmly, and the court clerk had completely abandoned any pretense of working, fully absorbed in the scene before her. Therefore, Judge Harrison declared, "This court is going to make an unusual ruling." He picked up his gavel but didn't raise it. "The traffic citation is dismissed, but with a condition." Sarah tilted her head slightly, curious. The judge's face softened into a gentle smile. "The condition is that you accept my wife Margaret's and my invitation to dinner next Sunday after church. She would never forgive me if I had Sarah Mitchell in my courtroom and didn't at least try to arrange that." A wave of soft laughter swept through the courtroom. Even Sarah couldn't help but smile. "I would be honored, Your Honor," she replied graciously. "Furthermore," the judge continued, becoming serious again, "I want to use this moment to address everyone in this courtroom." He looked around at the gathered faces. "Today has been a powerful reminder that justice isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding context, recognizing character, and seeing the whole person who stands before us." He turned back to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you came into this courtroom ready to pay a fine, but you've given us all something far more valuable, a lesson in dignity, grace, and the importance of looking beyond our first impressions." The elderly woman in the back row whispered "Amen," loud enough for everyone to hear, causing another ripple of gentle laughter. "Case dismissed," Judge Harrison declared, finally bringing down his gavel with a gentle tap rather than his usual firm strike. "And Ms. Mitchell, please give my regards to the congregation at New Hope Baptist this Sunday. I have a feeling you'll be right on time." As Sarah turned to leave the defendant's position, spontaneous applause broke out in the courtroom. The judge made no attempt to silence it. Instead, he watched as members of the gallery reached out to touch Sarah's hand as she passed, offering quiet thanks for songs sung at weddings, comfort provided at funerals, and hope given in hospital rooms. The morning sun had reached its peak outside the courthouse windows, casting a warm glow throughout the room, as Sarah Mitchell made her way down the center aisle, her dignity intact and her grace undiminished. Judge William Harrison found himself humming one of her songs, "Amazing Grace." The irony of the title didn't escape him, and as he watched her leave, he knew that his courtroom would never be quite the same again. Some lessons about justice came from law books, he reflected, but the most important ones came from unexpected moments like these, when prejudice gave way to understanding, and when the true measure of a person was found not in a single moment's mistake, but in a lifetime of serving others.